All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast. And today's episode is a ripper, folks. We are diving deep into everything you need to know about the federal budget that was delivered 2 days ago. And folks, we brought in the big guns. I get to curate our very own Ben Kingsley, but we've also got Evan Lucas on the show as well. It is a big show. What else do we cover, Ben?
Well, mate, when we're looking at the budget, it is going to be judged on the inflation outcome. So they're rolling the dice in terms of what's going to happen with inflation, which ultimately impacts what's going to happen with interest rates. And then Bryce will unpack the winners and losers of this year's federal budget.
We unpack the winners and losers, folks. Let's rip into the show.
Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance, and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast, and welcome back to you too, Ben. How are you?
Mate, I'm well. My footy team won on the weekend. You know that always sets me up for a good week and almost close to the next round. So, how'd your team go?
Not so great, mate. We had a sad passing of Cam McCarthy in the club, so that wasn't so great, was it? But
No.
Obviously a fitting tribute to him at the beginning of the game. But
Agreed.
mate, we've got a busy podcast today. We've got a special guest today because we're going to unpack everything you need to know about the federal budget delivered just 2 days ago. So before I introduce our special guest, we've got a couple of things we want to talk about, Ben. There was a bonus episode this week because 2024 is the golden year for tax planning. You had a little chat with our chief tax advisor. Her name is Julia Hartman. There's a fact sheet in that episode as well, Ben. But in 20 words or less, can you let our listeners know why they should go and listen to why it is the golden year for tax planning, Ben?
Yeah, well, quite simply that the tax brackets are changing, and that doesn't happen very often. So if you can forward book some of your expenses into the current tax year, that'll save you money or give you a bigger tax return. So that's why it's a golden year for tax planning as opposed to the traditional stuff that we might talk about each year. So we unpack a lot of that in terms of some of the ideas about what you might be thinking about. But remember, that means tax planning now has to happen before 30 June, and you shouldn't be leaving it to the last minute because you might miss out on that. So have a listen to that episode and get that fact sheet. And so hopefully that might help you talk to your accountant and save you a little bit more tax price.
Yeah, because normally when you forward book expenses, Ben, it only helps you in 1 year because for every subsequent year you're chasing it. But this time, to your point around having differences in chasing that outcome, there is some optimization. So check that out, folks. It's in your feed wherever you listen to podcasts. It was a great app. Hey, my Mindset Minute theme today, Ben. I am reading The Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday. I think I've mentioned this to you on this podcast before. Little bite-sized chunk every day. Love it, right? This one really stood out for me. It said, our well-being lies in our actions. And this was from Marcus Aurelius, a very prominent Stoic. And he said this: those obsessed with glory attach their well-being to the regard of others. Those who love pleasure tie it to feelings. But the one with true understanding seeks it only in their actions. Very good statement. Mm-hmm. Think on the character of people one wishes to please, the possessions one means to gain, and the tactic one employs to such ends. How quickly time erases such things, and how many will yet be wiped away. Marcus Aurelius. Okay, so then what happens is it goes in a little bit of that's wisdom, almost proverb style, Ben, but then expand. So if your happiness is dependent on accomplishing certain goals, what happens if fate intervenes? What if you're snubbed? What if outside events interrupt? What if you achieve everything but find that nobody is impressed? That's important, right? That's the problem with letting your happiness be determined by things you can't control. It's an insane risk. If an actor focuses on the public reception to a project, whether critics like it or whether it's a hit, they will constantly be disappointed and hurt. But if they love their performance and put everything they have into making it their best they're capable of, they will always find satisfaction in their job. Re-listen to that, folks. That is such a powerful statement. So, like them, We should take pleasure from our actions in taking the right actions rather than the results that come from them. Our ambition should not be to win then, but to play with our full effort. Our intention is not to be thanked or recognised, but to help and do what we think is right. Our focus is not on what happens to us, but on how we respond. In this, we will always find contentment and resilience. Ben, I was thinking about this the other day when I was watching Jim Chalmers, who imagine that feeling when he walks out the morning after. He's just delivered a budget and he's just about to get a whooshka of public opinion, interest
from
groups.
The friendlies. Yep.
Oh, it's just. Can you imagine just walking into that? And I did watch it, and he had a little bit of swagger about him. I wonder if he gets to reflect on his actions, Ben, and judge himself on, did he do the best that he could do based on the information that he had, based on the agenda that he was trying to achieve, based on the goal that they're just trying to stay in power, versus whether or not he needs the journalists and the interviewers and the columnists and everyone who's going to have a crack at him. Can you? I would have wanted that job for quids, mate. Just to walk out and take the heat like that.
I mean, because you're right. The point being there is that he's voted in by the people. So now, obviously, when you're in your little constituents and you're the treasurer, you're normally going to get voted in, right? Because everyone likes to associate with, someone who's famous or popular, and so that's how you would potentially continue to get voted in. But to your point, I mean, I wonder if he, has that fear of public opinion, or he's got that resolve internally to be able to manage that, because, he's playing a populist game.
I feel like he has to manage that, right? He has to go, I can only be judged on the actions that I took to get this budget prepared and ready. And did I give it my all? And if I did, I could put my head on the pillow, because at the end of that following day, I can imagine he's a death by 1,000 cuts. And
how much of it is him versus long meters in treasury with the men in dark suits who are also pulling the levers behind it. I mean, it's fascinating, but it's, these people put themselves in service, for whatever their motivations and value sets are. Some it's power, some, they do want to make a meaningful difference to people's lives. And I think probably Jim goes into that back category. Most people who start in that particular space think that, they've got all the answers to the problems of the world and they want to go and change those. And I think that's, really honourable. But then to actually have to deal with all of the other aspects of it and the judgment and that's where you do need to basically not care about basically the populace and the public opinion, but it votes you in or votes you out, unfortunately.
There you go. Marcus Aurelius said it, folks. Our well-being lies in our actions. Ponder that as you go into your week. Now, Ben, you and I had a conversation about the budget with our good friend Evan Lucas. He's the ambassador for Moorr, and he had some media commitments when we got to chat to him, so we got a window of his time. So let's have a little listen to the conversation you and I recently had with Evan Lucas regarding everything you need to know about the federal budget. All right, folks, today we are going to review the federal budget that was handed down 2 nights ago. We've got a special guest, a returning guest on the podcast. We are joined by Evan Lucas. He's a keynote speaker, independent analyst, author of Mind Over Money. He's a money expert, and he's also the ambassador for the Moorr app. Welcome back to the Property Couch, Evan.
Bryce, thanks for having me. I'm very excited about this. I know Ben and I have been eagerly talking about this for the last 48 hours and really sort of getting into the nitty-gritty. We will do that to some extent, but we do want to actually make it relatable to what matters to you guys out there listening or watching. Does matter, because there are lots of things and bits and pieces in this budget that will be debated, not just over the last couple of days and today on Thursday, but if you listen to this into the future, it will be a great discussion, because there is some interesting positions that has probably made the government ask the question about how far away they are from an election. And I don't think that's a hard thing to argue.
Yeah, we're going to go into that in some depth. And I think the important point that you raised there too is you two love the economics. And so I'm going to make sure that we bring it back to give high level for those who want high level and get some detail for those people who want details as well. But we're going to cover, first of all, we're going to talk about the elephant in the room. What impact did it have from an inflationary perspective? We're going to build some context around why the budget was delivered. We're going to ask the question of you, Evan. What were you hoping for before the budget was delivered, and how did that reflect what you got? We'll go through the usual winners and losers. We'll do some implications and some analysis of how that goes through the economy and any social impacts. And then we've got a question from a TPC listener who's keen to get some feedback as well. But let's dive in, gents. I might throw it to you first, Ben, but I think it might be helpful to build some context around which this budget was delivered on Tuesday night.
Yeah, and I think it's a good reminder, Bryce, for anyone who looks at politics and, how important politics is more broadly speaking. What you've got to understand is we've got two big political parties in this country, and they are fighting to be in power. And when they're in power, they obviously have a chance to then implement their views of the world, their ideology, how they think it can best serve Australia, right? So both sides of politics are well-intentioned. And then obviously there's the messy middle in terms of where the politics lives, in terms of how you run an economy. Because the most important part about running the politics or running a country is the economy, all right? Because if you think about it logically, the bigger you can grow the economy, the more money, in other words, tax receipts and revenue the government has, and then ultimately that can then supply services and needs to the community, right? So that's the ultimate thing. Now what we've seen in history is we've traditionally had very disciplined governments over the years, where, like a household, we try and keep everything in balance. Right now, what we are seeing, however, in probably the last sort of decade and a bit, we're definitely seeing both sides of politics more interested in actually staying in power and buying votes than actually doing the hard work that needs to be done and the reform work that needs to be done to basically take the economy to its next phase of growth, which also obviously means that if there is money there, then services and living standards and all of those things that we take, and we're so lucky in this great country to have, are impacted by that. So I think that's the context that we want to present this in. So whether it's Labor in power or Liberal in power, their ultimately number one goal is to stay in power, because they believe in their heart of hearts that whatever they do is in the best interest of the country, okay? And that's why they want to stay in power. So when they put a budget in front of us, you've got to ask yourself a question: is it an economic budget? Is it in the best interest of growing the economy? Or is it a budget that's more interested in the political cycle when an election is coming up, which Evan alluded to? So I think that's the sort of place setter. And what we'll try and do is be judgmental on that as commentators in terms of how well they've done with this particular budget, Bryce.
Yeah, it's clearly a pre-election budget designed to win over Middle Australia. But to Ben's point there, Evan, do you think that reform is something that we will see in the future? If you think back to the Hawke-Keating era, before social media, there was reforms done. But given the short timeframes and the fact, to Ben's point, that the goal is to stay in power, how do they actually get reform done, particularly in a social media world?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised the Hawke-Keating era, because Ben was sort of alluding to that before. So if you look at positive reforms that grew productivity, allowed services to expand, was a government that was still behind the overall population. I'm not going to use the word electorate, because I think I hate that term. It creates sides over the population. The Hawke-Keating era, the floating of the Australian dollar, the bringing in of superannuation, the deregulation and movements, particularly to bust up some of the union agreements, despite the fact that obviously they had huge affiliations with Bob Hawke. Then you go to the Howard early years, and I deliberately say the early years, the introduction of the GST. Everybody has this slight negative view, but remember about the efficiencies that brought: getting rid of wholesale tax, getting rid of retail tax, getting all of these really inefficient taxes that were across the board. So that's reform, right? And you asked me at the start of this, Bryce, what would I love to have seen in this budget that wasn't there? It's tax reform, right? We have the reform in this budget basically doesn't exist. And I also want to point this out very clearly. This is not just a Labor problem. Ben put it perfectly. The last, probably even I'd argue 2 decades, the Charlie Munger story that Ben loves to talk to you about over and over, and I'm going to sort of really sum it down to one sort of line that he uses, which is that if the electorate works out how to vote for the money, they'll do that, right? So it says it a bit more than that, but that's the simplistic way of saying it. And I think we've also got to take some blame for that as the electorate. We do. The population has worked out that has gone from we want into we need. And if we need, the government will provide. And that's sort of part of this. So I know that's a bit of broad brush there on you, Bryce, but that gets back to that question about social media and reform, is that reform is painful. Reform is change. Reform is behavior adaptation. And unless we're forced upon it, COVID-19, GFC, we probably will buck it. So you will have social media that will find echo groups that will not like reform. The government had that opportunity probably in its belt, considering it's a first-term government. History shows that a one-term government doesn't happen, so they're likely to get in no matter what they were going to do, although it might be in a minority. And they had the momentum. There was a need for change. There'd been a coalition government in power since 2013. So we're talking almost a decade. So the electorate was sort of there. Then you've got this new age thing that's also come about. We didn't vote for it. You can't reform because we didn't vote for that. And gets back to Ben's point, we're clearly coming up to an election because they're clearly spending, and we'll come to that with the table of truth in a minute, but they're also not presenting new policy to take to the election for reform. So all of that answers personally, what didn't I see, which I wish was there? Tax reform. Was this an expansionary government? Yes. Was this going to be an election year budget? Yeah. There is no short and tall of it. This is clearly designed to get through an election that we're going to have sometime in the next 13 months.
So this is a question to either of you, but what would it take to, notwithstanding what you just said, the last government that took major reform to an election had a surprise loss. So notwithstanding everything you just talked about, what would it take to actually get reform over the line, all things considered? Because we are in a social media world. We are in a situation where the population's learned how to vote themselves in. We are in a situation that in living memory, someone saw taking to reform got them a surprise defeat. So what would it take?
So, Bryce, I'll have a go at that. I mean, ultimately, the general populace of this country isn't super educated when it comes to the economy and macroeconomics, right? So they look at it in certain soundbite terms, and so the natural self-interest is always there. That's why the populace votes themselves the money, and that's when you get yourself into incredible dramas with your democracy and your economy, and the whole thing implodes on itself over time. And we saw with the first attempt at GST reform that failed as well. So I think our job as people who study this and also see the importance of growing the economic pie is to educate people why an increase in GST is actually a very good tax, because it's a consumption-based tax. And ultimately that means that, if you spend more as someone who's earning more or whatever, you ultimately pay more tax. Okay. And so it's quite a very sort of equally weighted tax. Now, there'll obviously be a percentage of people who say, well, the most vulnerable are the most affected because ultimately they don't have a lot of money. And so you've still got to make sure that, you are looking after the most vulnerable in the community. But what you want to be able to do is, when you are looking at reform in that area, you don't want to go overs. Like, there's going to be a lot of people saying, I don't like paying any more tax than I have to, and so I won't vote in any sort of tax reform because it means ultimately I'm going to be paying more. But in the light of day, the GST was a significant improvement in the way in which we look at tax. But when we do, big tax reviews and all of that, the governments of the day rule out GST. So all of a sudden, we're not even having a fair debate. Like, ultimately,
I want to jump in on you there because
sure.
I think it's a beautiful point, Ben, that the GST is seen as this big, bad consumption tax that's going to hurt the poor and that it's actually not fair. So first and foremost, you've already described part and parcel is that it spreads the load. So this is the first part of it. It spreads the load. The other thing that comes with tax reform and getting better productivity and all that stuff that, Bryce, you asked me before, tax reform is not one piece. It's a broad brush. So if we go back to the Henry Review, and the reason I want to use the Henry Review is that this was commissioned by a Labor government, which we currently have in there. And in the main, it actually turned purple. And what I mean by that is that the Liberal Party embraced a lot of it as well. Neither of them put it in, but both of them embraced the majority of it. So taking Ben's GST point, that socioeconomic impact, what the Henry Tax Review pointed out was that if you were to jump up the GST to 15%, which is probably what it should be, you can then get rid of bracket creep. Because what they were suggesting is that we should only have 3 bands of personal income tax. And it would mean that the tax threshold would have gone up to 50 grand. So those in the social economic impact, what it's basically saying is that your flat rate of tax is 15%. That's how it would look, because you pay that through consumption, that you realistically would see a little bit of an increase, but 15% on $3, it's something you buy at Coles or Woolies, is incrementally not that big. But all of your personal tax comes back to you, and you can efficiently use that better, because it means that if you work, you get rewarded for work rather than having to give immediately after 20 grand, 18% back to the government, and so on and so forth. So this is what's lost in this debate, is that it's always cherry picking. You're always looking, I don't like GST increase, full stop, not including the fact that actually the whole tax reform concept is the broad brush. GST got rid of all those other taxes I said before. Going back to the Hawke and Keating era, got rid of all of those union agreements that were just dragging down productivity because they had so much regulation, so much drag on productivity. And boom, off we went. The 80s and even the recession we had in the 90s was very light compared to the rest of the world, but the expansion and the increase it gave to the productivity of this country has been amazing. And Labor should be championing that, and they do, but they forget how they did it. And that's what makes me upset. The Liberal Party is doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, politics is one in the centre, Bryce, to your point, in terms of taking people on a journey. So what you had with Hawke and Keating was they were like Keating was a genius when it came to the economic understanding of macroeconomics and, the recession that we had to have and the rebooting and getting inflation down. But he had to take the unions on the journey, right? So, those people had to basically allow this to happen. Now, if Liberals were fighting unions, would that have ever happened? Would that HR reform have taken shape? Maybe not. So that's the challenge that the Libs have got. But ultimately, it's set us up for effectively decades of further economic growth. Now, for us to go on our next journey of decades upon decades of continuing to grow the economic pie, we need to make reform in GST. We need to look at stamp duty in terms of how we charge that, because ultimately people get stuck in place. There's no human mobility. There's none of that ability to then, obviously humans are the biggest capital that we have. They're the most important component, as is investment into that. And then we've got to look at those input costs. We've got to, we're going on a transition to renewable energy, which we'll talk about later. But ultimately, you've got to get the fundamentals right. You've got to make power super cheap, right? Because that's one of the biggest input costs. Energy is one of the biggest input costs in everything that we do. So if we can go to net zero energy over the course of the next decade, we can then also reform a consumption tax, would allow us to grow the economic pie. And that ultimately means the government will have more money to share and provide those services to the most needy. But what we've also got to remember is that it can't just be handouts. Everyone putting their hand up, oh, we got problems over here, government need to fix our problems. We got problems over there, government need to fix our problems. So they just keep throwing money everywhere. So as much as there's a revenue shortfall, there is this chronic overspending problem that we have. And I think that's a good lead in.
I was going to say, that's a perfect lead into the
Can I just jump in there and ask you this question just to round it out in a different way? Logically, that totally makes sense. What you said about pegging back personal tax rates, Evan, makes sense. Ben, what you're saying about growing the pie makes sense, and what it says about spreading the load broader. What are the conditions? I'll ask you this, Evan. What are the conditions it would take for a government in power to actually do what you just said? Given that, a lot of governments get in marginally, what would it take for them to actually make a bold move and do it? Because we've got commentary here. We've got 1,000 other commentators, all probably having similar views. But when someone's goal is to remain in power, the logic doesn't necessarily win the day.
Yeah, and I think it's not even logic. It's the personal impact, right? So again, politicians are human beings, whether you agree with that statement or not. I mean, I know some of you might not think they are at all, but politicians go in this, as Ben said at the start, for the right reasons, of all persuasions and of all colours. They also, therefore, they are human, and therefore they are going to make decisions that they are basing for the electorate that is still slightly personal, right? So again, that's why they talk about, backbenchers get nervous about losing their jobs, because they're going to. If they get voted out, they lose their job and they're back to square one. And all of what they've worked for could also be lost. I mean, they could have been a career politician. So that's slightly got to be part of the answer, in the fact that it's like what we talk about, in whether it's investing, whether it's buying your first home as your own occupier or as an investment. When's the right time? Well, the answer is now, because it's never the right time. And therefore, I think the argument is that, yes, there is always going to be a reason not to do it. Right now, cost of living pressure can't do the tax reform that's needed. You go back GFC, you go back COVID, there's never a right time. So realistically, the answer in my view is now.
So can I also have a go at answering that, Bryce? We don't trust our politicians
Yep.
because they break promises, right? And we can see when they're lying through their front teeth because they've got to toe the political line, and they've got to look united. The only way this can happen is we've got to change the narrative. So it's people like Evan, it's people that have a voice, and that are out there that are continuing sharing that voice to the broader community. And it's when that narrative changes in the broader community that we say, actually, that sort of makes a bit of sense. So if the trade-off is that we have high GST, but I have an improved, tax take in terms of my PAYG tax, or, I can get rid of a bit of stamp duty, or I can, reduce all these other taxes because it's a pay-as-you-go tax, then all of a sudden it's like, if we can change that narrative in the community, because what happens is, there'll be the focus groups from the Liberal Party and the Labor Party. They'll be looking at their numbers in terms of the testing that they do, and they'll say, you can't touch GST yet. People aren't ready for GST. So it is reliant on people like us through our communities, and then our people in our community telling other people, it's actually not a bad thing. Don't be afraid of a 15% GST, because there will be some upshot in terms of growing the economic pie.
Yep.
And that's the number one job they've got, is to keep growing the economic pie. So I think that's the way in which you can get it. They then go out there and do their focus groups, and all of a sudden people are like, there is a little bit of an appetite for that. And then the politicians can build on that narrative, tell the story why, and argue their case. But at the moment, what we've got is the narrative all around, I'm gonna solve your problem by throwing money at every problem that everyone's got. And that is not the way you run an economy. We can't run our households that way. We can't sit back and say, well, I know that you want to do this, this, and this. We've got to be fiscally disciplined. So does the governments, not only federal, but also state governments as part of that story.
So, Evan, it requires a political perfect storm, to be honest, doesn't it? You need to have a government that's in with an overwhelming majority of seats and an appetite for reform. And if you get those two, you probably have some conditions where they might be able to do it. But for as long as you don't have both of those in place, it's probably going to be a debate we have for every budget for the next 10 years.
Yeah, exactly right. And so let me bring you to the chart of truth, I'm going to call it, rather than the table, because in the budget papers it's a table. But the chart that I've brought in to show here is to show the decisions that have been made by this current government in terms of spending and taxes, in terms of the increases they've made in both. And you can see for the first 2 years of their time in power, they were pretty controlled and pretty measured. They stepped it up last year with regards to the energy rebate. But overall, they didn't really do what we've seen traditionally over the last decade and a half pre-COVID, because I don't want to include COVID. COVID's a complete misnomer about spending.
Yeah,
is that they had been quite below trend with regards to what the electorate, and as Ben perfectly pointed out, how much money they're going to hand back to you and I and everyone out there listening. That has gone by the wayside. So the jump up in spending that has happened on Tuesday is really quite confronting, and so much so that it's surprised a lot of people around just how much additional. They used a beautiful political statement, unavoidable spending. What an incredible term that is, because that is just the greatest way to politically sell, we have to do this, I'm really sorry, it's unavoidable. Well, actually, that's rubbish. It is avoidable. There was stuff in there that definitely didn't need to be in it. First and foremost, the $300 energy rebate to every single household, completely non-means tested, completely ignoring what some states are doing. So Queensland, Western Australia giving $1,000 and $400 respectively on top of that.
Evan, that was their apology for telling everyone that was their apology to everyone, saying we got it wrong, that energy prices weren't going to go up under the Labor government. So I mean, I don't think it's enough an apology, but I suspect that's the way these politicians can think. Oh, we really didn't get that right, and that's going to be what they're going to be attacked on in the upcoming election. So they're saying, well, we had this extra bit of money. Well, actually, no, we didn't. We basically have used future money. We're spending our future money now to give everyone a three. So to just make that feel a little bit better, because we lied to you about basically energy costs going up.
And then that brings me to the second chart that I've brought in as well, which is the deficit projections and the fact that of the $24.8 billion of additional spending, so this is not including the $30 billion of spending they'd already put in, the additional spending will now mean that FY25 takes us to a deficit of over $8 billion, and then there will be a deficit of over $11 billion. That forward spending, that $24.8 billion, 80% of it comes in the next 2 years. So it starts from July 1 this year, because it's FY25, and then goes into FY26. That is a staggering amount of money to be putting in at a time when the narrow path got incredibly narrow, as you and I talked about in our RBA update, Ben, around where inflation is sitting. Because even if you are the most one-eyed supporter of either side of politics, the market economist in me says you cannot put that amount of money in without hurting it. The rule of thumb, the way to argue this to you as well, for every $7 billion of government spending, it's the equivalent of the RBA cutting rates by 0.2 of 1%. So we've got an additional $24.8 billion over the next 4 years, which is technically 3 and a touch rate cuts from the RBA in stimulus. Now, does that mean they have to go the flip side and hike rates 3 times to offset it? That will be the question going forward.
Well, let's talk to that point, gents. There was a couple of things that were announced on Tuesday night. The energy subsidy of $300 to every household, and on top of what you've already talked about in state governments around the country, there was increasing in rental assistance. There was Future Made in Australia incentives for green energy, right? So the going into the budget, the talk was about how do we tame the inflation tiger. The government's done it in a way that is in plain sight to everyone. Clearly, it won't have an impact. Some of the spending won't have an impact on the inflation read, but it's not as if the RBA won't be taking that into consideration. So, to both of you,
they can ignore it, Bryce. So what I mean by that is that they're putting it into energy, as Ben's highlighted. That does not fit into core inflation. That does not sit inside trim mean. If anything, what we've just been discussing about is what's called secondary inflation, where, okay, you get your $300 as a household, you get your rental assistance. Now, the rental one is interesting because that does impact core inflation because that's inside that sticky number. But overall, it's going to spread elsewhere. If you've got $300 that you're not having to put to your energy bill, you're going to put it to your food bill. You're going to put it towards your education and health bill. Victoria is the great example as well. If you don't have $400 to have to pay to public schooling, are you going to go out and spend on the kids, not the uniforms, but discretionary clothing and apparel attire? You'll start to see a tick up in inflation there because demand picks up. So yes, the government will be able to say, look, this metric went down in inflation. We've taken 0.5% out of the inflation read on the headline. The RBA will look around and go, well, but hang on a minute, on core inflation, it's not only has it not moved, it's actually ticking up. And I think that's where, one of Ben's big points is that. And I think, mate, I'm going to throw it to you. You go.
Yeah, Ben, well, that's a good point because one of the losers of this budget is clearly the Reserve Bank and the question of interest rates. Keen for your commentary around. There's a lot of people prior to the budget pinning their hopes on an interest rate cut in 2024. Did that just get harder?
It definitely got a lot harder. So, because of the mechanics of what we've just been talking about in terms of taking 0.5, Treasury is forecasting taking 0.5 off the overall CPI read based on the electricity handouts. We've also got to remember that there's a 10% increase also on rental assistance. So that is inside core. Now that's on the back of a 15% increase from the year before. So, and yep, renters are doing it tough, so I can understand that. So that has a little bit more of a kicker in terms of core inflation. But it's the problem we've got here, Bryce, and that is that when you're looking at fiscal policy and monetary policy, what you're trying to do is that they need to be working in tandem, right? They need to be hand-in-glove type arrangements. Now, again, this is the problem and the challenge that any political party in power has. So I'm not kicking Labor. I'm just basically saying that they want to earn a second term. And so they needed to try and thread the needle in terms of trying to get what they think is right. And that is, we know that our spending is going to be inflationary. So are there any sort of little magic tricks that we can use to bring inflation down? Because what we are seeing is the consumers doing their job in terms of spending less. But, in terms of government spending, that's way up, not only at the federal level, but also at the commitments that are being made. So, the Queensland, Victorian and Western Australian government, sort of budgets, they were expansionary budgets, right? So they are stimulus type of budgets. When what we really do need is basically everyone to sit on their hands for 12 months to get inflation under control. Then we can go for gold, right? Once we got that inflation genie back in the bottle. But that's the challenge that that Labor has of regaining power, and that is that if they're going to go to an election in March, April, May, do they have another chance to do another budget? Well, we've seen that the forward estimates are for a $28 billion deficit. If they're going to go and do these big spending pledges, if they don't want to put it in the budget, they go and borrow the money, like the $80 billion that we've borrowed for a lot of the projects, like, hydro, snowy hydro 3.0, all of those other things that they're spending, they don't put that on the books, right? They go and borrow money for those types of things. So we've also got, a huge amount of interest that's going to also then be part of that. And that's the biggest problem we have in Victoria is when we get to the debt levels that are finally predicted, we're talking about, I think it's $28 million a day in interest. Like, it is ridiculous numbers. I mean, they are hard to recover from. You're basically in a debt spiral. And so we don't want to be in that particular story. And so that's potentially why the Victorian government may need to be bailed out by the federal government. So I know I'm going off in tangents here, but it's universal over the last sort of 2 days since the budget was released that all economists agree that this was more explanatory in terms of than they would have expected. And it does make the RBA job so much harder for Michelle Bullock in terms of what she has to do and the board. And so it does lead to a conclusion that interest rates will most likely stay higher for longer.
Subsidies are not a magic bullet, right? So a subsidy is just basically moving around who ends up getting the total sum of the pie, right? So the price hasn't changed. It's just how the price is reached. So if it's 80% by the consumer and then 20% by the government, it's still 100% of the price that we would have paid no matter what. That's the short summary of this as well. Subsidies are not a magic bullet to fix inflation.
Yeah, so let's talk to that point, right? So we've got a government who is trying to get inflation down technically, and clearly trying to engineer a rate cut before they go to the polls next year. Mm-hmm. Is this budget likely to backfire and cause an interest rate to rise, given the tone of the notes of the last RBA meeting?
So, all things being equal, that's certainly suggesting to be the case. I mean, again, the way it's been done is mechanically moving inflation lower. So it may, and Michelle Bullock has been at pains since she's taken over to keep her powder completely dry of moving into fiscal policy. And politicians will happily move into monetary policy, but there's a reason why technocrats won't go the other way around. And you can already see that likely the RBA is going to try and use as much neutral language as possible. We're reassessing how this works. We are waiting to see the data. We want to see the reaction from the population and the impacts on sentiment and spending and all those kinds of things before we make that decision. So that's what you're going to hear from the RBA. but they will be very, very aware that they now have to deal with a scenario where there is more money coming into the economy than was factored into their forecasts. There is more money coming into the household that they are trying to rein in and tighten on. And they open very clearly that monetary policy is tight. They know the impact it's having on the household. But they now have a counteractory scenario where fiscal policy is slightly unwinding that tightening bias that they want to put into the household by giving them relief. So whether they raise rates or not is a different story. I think we've sort of been skirting around this. The electorate's picked up on the idea that they would actually probably prefer a rate cut than getting handouts. They would rather have less pressure through the house and through the mortgages that they hold than getting government to support them to deal with the fact that their house costs are so high. And I think that's the unknown political question to what you're asking there, Bryce, is will they like this budget? Will they be happy that they're getting more handouts, that the cost of living relief is coming from a government? I think you can already see that they're actually worried now that the government has gone too far and that the government is now too much involved with trying to fix the household budget and the around the dinner table discussion with tweaks at the edge rather than their biggest core factor and their biggest core focus is how am I going to get my mortgage back into a level that I can afford? And I think that will be the question from an electoral point of view, from an election question. Does the household go, guys, I can't have you tweaking externally to what we're trying to do at the household because the RBA has made us basically pay more for our home? I think that's what I'm starting to see is the response. The electorate's wary of this and very aware of the impact it could have from the RBA and therefore directly impacting them, which is around their mortgage.
In your experience, how much would the RBA board have known? Because the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, went on to Breakfast TV the day after the budget and said that he's in constant dialogue with the RBA governor and has been for some time and keeping her well informed on what's going on. And given the budget release wasn't that long after the last RBA board meeting, how informed do you think that she would have been around what was coming some week and a bit later?
Reasonably. And the reason I say that quite confidently, don't forget the head of Treasury sits on the board, right? Yeah. So there is, I'm going to get his name. It's not Stephen Jones. It's the other one, the other Stephen. He is on the board, right? So he's technically, very much providing back what Treasury's modelling is, what Treasury is currently, looking at from the government spending and fiscal side of the policy. He sits on the board. So she would have had that input from the board. And under the new restructure, his input is very, very high or higher than it was before because of the new structure. So they would have known to a point, and I need to point that out very clearly. He still needs to be independent. He is still the head advisor to the government and the government policy that needs to be independent of monetary and vice versa. So he would have been able to give some indication and quite a reasonable amount, but not to the the granular level that we now have and had 48 hours of digesting.
Yeah, so the statement of monetary policy that we also saw released had different forecasts to what Treasury had in this budget paper, and they're only a week apart. So that's that independence that Evan's talking about. And make no mistake, I mean, Michelle Bullock has been an assistant governor for a long time, mate. She's a seasonal...
Sorry to interrupt. Stephen Kennedy. I knew I'd remember it.
So she's a seasonal campaigner, right? So, and she understands the politics. Like, they're trying to win a second term. This is a juggling act, a difficult balancing act that the Labor Party has to perform to try and, stay in government. So she's going to understand the politics of it, and she's just got to, to Evan's point, play a very straight bat. But it does make her job a lot harder. I'll give you an example of some of the sort of spending decisions that are made, because like anything, anything in terms of running an economy is a judgment call or a trade-off. And so I follow Ben Phillips on Twitter. I really like some of the insights he provides. And he was talking about over the last 4 years, there's been a 66% increase in the amount of childcare subsidies that are being offered to families, right? And that's that sort of, the way in which Labor looks after the family market and sort of listens intently in terms of what that looks like. Now, that's government support. Now, that bakes in another $1 billion plus going forward, plus indexation in terms of costs. Now, what hasn't happened is because obviously, in terms of childcare fees are still going up. How much of the pay the wages to increase the baseline wages for childcare workers needs to be fronted up by the businesses and potentially by the consumers who use that product? Because ultimately, if you just keep throwing government money at it, similar to the way in which aged care, now they were very clear about doing this. So I'm not saying that they shouldn't have done it. They said, we are going to throw money at childcare workers. We're going to throw money at aged care working, and we're going to bring that wage base up to a level that will attract people to work in that space and increase the professionalism and reward for effort. So I'm not judging that, but I'm just sort of saying they are perfect examples of judgment calls and trade-offs that are going to be made. And they add to the spending story without actually addressing anything to do with the revenue story as part of that.
I'm going to go slightly against you on that one. And the reason I want to say that is what they have also started to work out with childcare is that it is one of, if not the biggest barrier of entry to dual couples and dual income families. So since they've increased the childcare subsidy, the amount of women that are participating in the workforce has gone to a record all-time high. The other thing that's happened with that is that there are therefore more people employed, more full-time employment, and it partly explains why personal income tax is now 55% of the total revenue of the government's take-home pay packet. So I agree with what Ben's saying.
Yeah, so just to that point, all I'm saying is that it have to be all government money, 66% increase, or could it have been, smart money and investment money, and obviously the cost, so the subsidies that we're talking about here. So I see the overall benefit, but I'm sort of saying it seems to me it's another example of government has to fix the problem rather than the free market fixing the problem. Right, and with all the regulations and all of those other things, because usually free markets should be able to also play a role in that. Now, this is where, again, the ideologies of different political parties say, no, it wasn't happening, and so we're going to intervene in that market, throw money at it, and I get the net benefit that's going on.
We also have the issue of ABC Learning that's still very much in the population's thought process, that when we did have a free market provider, they cannibalised and away we went. And we've got G8 Education, which also slightly goes in that way as well. On your point, I agree with that. But this is where the government's argument straight away comes back, is that this is probably one thing where having, basically, should the question be really, do we need to turn childcare into a state-based education system?
Yep.
And that would be the point that you're raising, Ben, about making a more efficient, more capable long-term program where we take it away completely and have a public system on childcare, pay the wages that are probably required. It goes through taxation, spread across the whole electorate and the whole population, and therefore away you go, because we know that the efficiencies that therefore it brings to dual income homes, and we know that dual income homes are the future, because again, cost of living is part of it, but also the overall well-being. So this is, again, gets back to Bryce's question about what would you have loved to have seen with reform? What would you have loved to have seen? This is all part of it. And this isn't far left, far right policy. This isn't, ideological X and Z versus Labor, Liberal, Green, Labor, blah, blah, blah. It's just really simple, common, interested, and for the whole community's benefit. But we are, and again, Bryce is right, when you have microcosms through social media, through focus groups, through individuals that are now actually the ones that get voted into power, common sense and common ground are not the same thing.
Yeah. Hey, before we pivot, Evan, can you make it crystal clear for our audience, irrespective of their economic literacy, why this subsidy was able to, why the government sees that as a way to manipulate the inflation read, and why they did it?
Yeah. So this is for the energy one you're talking about here, isn't it, Bryce?
$300. Yep.
Yeah. So why they're doing it is that the way the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ABS, reads the figures for its inflationary calculations takes the consumer line only. So that's the simplest way to say it to you. It's not that clear, but it's basically that cost that would have been to the consumer, that end figure that you get from your electrical gas retailer, That is the energy figure that the ABS takes. But if upstream, as we refer to it, so if the government then comes in on top of that and says, what is the overall cost that you're going to have to pay to the consumer? It's X. Right. Well, we're going to take X minus $300, and then you're going to get the $300 now through to the consumer. It's X minus 300. From the inflation read, it's therefore reduced by that amount. So the increase in price,
$325 for small business as well.
Yes, correct.
So
and I'm glad you put that
those
in.
two parts.
Put that all together. So that is the very simplistic way of saying it. So that's why we call it mechanically lowering inflation, because they are taking basically the statistics, working out how the statistics are worked out, and then making sure that they can mechanically move the statistics lower because of where it's read.
Energy costs aren't decreasing. It's just basically that's the way in which they can manipulate the outcome.
Yeah, so that is the way to answer that question, and why market economists particularly are like, they haven't actually improved inflation. They've just shifted the cost out of the inflation read. It's like when you hear them talk about on budget sheet and off budget sheet spending from the government, which is absolutely a ludicrous thing to say.
Yeah.
But all these infrastructure projects that are off budget, that are in the hundreds of billions of dollars, they're still part of the budget. They're still part of the overall debt structure the country has. It's just not having to be argued inside the operational year-on-year budget of the government rather than the long-term structural budget.
Yeah. Now,
Technical, boring rubbish.
Well, no, it's good. I think it's good for everyone to understand how that works, right? Because instead of just getting $300 in your hand that you go and spend, which would likely go into the inflation read, they've done it in a way that mechanically means that the inflation rate will be down. And I think if people are informed and they can see what happened, they can start to see what's going on with some of the headlines. But Ben, every budget there's winners and losers. I'm going to go through a headline level, and then we're going to pick a couple each between the two of you, because if you pick them all, we will be here till next week, right? So the way that you two like to talk. But the winners, let's riff them off: green businesses, households, renters, the housing sector, elderly, aged care workers, students, public servants, defence and foreign affairs, and parents. They were the winners. The losers were the Reserve Bank. We talked at length to that. Consultants, cashed up foreigners, backpackers, engineered stone, dodgy NDIS providers, big businesses, and tax cheats. I'll start with you, Ben. Pick a couple. Which of the winners do you want to sort of lean on, and which one do you think has major impact for our listeners?
Well, I think we haven't spoken about the sort of biggest tax reform, because it's been spoken about for pretty much 12 months, and that's the stage 3 tax cuts and the adjustment that obviously occurred, right? So that meant that effectively every household across the country is getting a tax cut, and that obviously means that there'll be more money in those people's pockets. So they'll be pretty happy about that. Now, of course, it would also be remiss of us not to talk about the housing sector. We are a property podcast, so when we'll talk
about that at length in a minute. But if you want to talk headline.
Yeah, so well, outside of that, I mean, ultimately the elderly are always going to, be looked after. They're a huge cohort. When you look at the demographic profiles, you've got a large sort of aging baby boomer cohort. You've got a smaller X-gen cohort, and then the Y-gen millennial cohort is as big as the baby boomer cohort. So, that's the difficulty that they're playing with in terms of that. You can see, obviously, aged care workers. The student one is also an interesting one, where you saw that the HEX debts of people that would be retrospectively fitted back to the year before, when we saw the inflation indexation at 7.1%. Now that's now been adjusted, so it means that the indexation will occur as the lower of the wage price story or inflation. So they'll take the lower of those two going forward, but because that's retrospective, that effectively means that there's going to be about $3 billion wiped off HEX debts, for around 3 million university students. So that's a good news story for them. There's a couple to start with from the winner side. Evan, what have you got?
Yeah, I think we can't go past what's going on. You've talked about the renters, and I think that needs to be pretty part and parcel, that, that additional $1.9 billion in the Commonwealth's rental assistance is going to be quite significant. We know how much of pain renters are feeling. Yes, we can have the debate about, owners v renters to the cows come home, but I think that part and parcel is a good thing. And the reason I say that is that it means hopefully They don't do what history tells us about getting assistance and that they spend it, that they put it towards savings, that savings can go towards a deposit that ends up means they go from the renter side and jump into the housing side and actually become an owner. So I think, one of the discussions that's always been going forward, particularly as you just highlighted there with the generation issue, Ben, is, younger millennials and realistically moving into Gen Zers that sort of sit there and go, we will never be able to save enough fast enough to actually get into the property market.
Yep.
That I think needs to be looked at in that context in terms of what sort of makes me a winner. I think, and I don't like to say this is a winner, but it needs to be discussed, which is green business. And the reason I say that, I still cannot understand how the Future Made in Australia policy has been framed. It's been framed like all of a sudden we're getting manufacturing back. It's not that. It is backing in green energy and green, potential in industries that are well established. So by well established, the solar production industry is well established. It's over 35, 40 years old. I mean, we've been making solar panels for that long, and China is one, right? America is showing that their attempt to do something similar has failed. They have not managed to get scale back. So that they are a winner in my view, in the fact that the money that they've managed to get funneled toward them is, great for that industry. It is and will be the future of global energy intake. And Ben's alluded to that, and I agree with that. I just don't think they should have been a winner. I think they should have been a neutral. I think there could have been better ways to move that dial. And they're the two that really catch my attention for listeners. Is the renters is the one that I think I'm completely fine with that subsidy. If it was, and my hope is that it goes to savings, to a longer term structural impact for the household being a house or some form of investment like that, and taking that pressure off basically, your rent swallowing up all of that savings that should have been going towards saving for a deposit.
So Ben, we will lean in on housing shortly, but if we just talk to some losers, we talked about the Reserve Bank, perhaps cashed up foreigners, dodgy NDIS providers, and big business. If you could give us some commentary around that, and then we will talk about some surprises.
Yeah, I mean, the NDIS one is a real challenge, right? I mean, if you look at the chart where we talk about where the spending's going, the big 5 programs of expenses that we put up on the screen here, NDIS is so difficult. You can see there the change in 24 financial year to 28 financial year is a 37% increase in cost. We just can't get on top of the NDIS costs. So far, in terms of the dodgy providers, and I've been pretty vocal on this about 12 months ago on Twitter as well, about all of the rorts and the schemes and the amount of money that people were charging for double drive out calls, and there was just rorting going on everywhere, and it was dragging teachers into that industry. It's just been a real problem. And so my understanding is that they've found around $13 billion worth of savings in terms of picking up these dodgy rorters. But guess what? Unfortunately, they've also projected around another sort of $13 to $14 billion of additional costs for eligible participants. So it's a real tough one. I mean, it's just, for those most vulnerable in our community, it has been life-changing for them. But the scope in terms of who it's servicing and how it's looking after, it's just going to be a massive, massive drain in terms of where we can find that money from.
Yeah, in short, the way I look at it is that nearly 40% of the NDIS is administration.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that is what needs to be highlighted. 40% is administration.
One of my fun ones there on that one, 468 million in new spending to find the cheaters.
Yeah.
468 million to find the people who are doing the wrong thing. I reckon if I could get a team of 20 developers and get access to the data, I don't need 468 million to find the dodgies. Correct. I'll just track their mobile phones and say, did they make 3 trips out there or not? Are they regenerating the same report for the 4 clients that they're looking after but charging the full tote? I mean, they get quote ranges and everyone quotes or everyone bills at the highest quote range. There is rorting going on everywhere there, but I don't need $468 million to find out where it is. Give me 30 million and I'll do a good job of it, right?
I can see the passion in your voice, Ben. I can, for those not watching, you can hear it in your voice. What about why are big businesses and cashed up foreigners losers, Ben?
Well, ultimately, in terms of big businesses, they're coming after, how they're shuffling their taxes around. And look, I don't mind that, so, they might be losers because they've got to pay more of their tax here in Australia. So all of that sort of, dodgy movement of money around and charging fees in different countries for marketing services in Singapore, and I'll keep chasing that down in terms of what that looks like. So I have no problems with that. There's obviously not a lot in there for stimulating businesses more broadly in terms of investment coming in outside of the green energy program that we looked at. So, again, I don't probably, they're losers, but I think the country is better off with those businesses paying their taxes here. And I have a view on, how I would potentially charge all the social media platforms on revenue rather than on profits that they make in this country. I think that would be another way of, getting those social envy platforms to pay their way here in this country.
And I guess the cashed up foreigners too are around the limitations around how many students we bring into the country.
Yeah, well, look, that's problematic because it's our third biggest export earner, and so I do see that as as a challenge. I mean, ultimately, that's money that's coming in, but they're obviously restricting that because they've got a political problem around the number of immigrants that are coming into the country, and that's
driving up rents.
That's driving up rents, and it's also driving up inflation. So but those universities and those schools and all of that, that's a huge money spinner for this country. So we've got to be careful in terms of, again, not overcorrecting that one.
And some pressure for the universities to provide their own student accommodation as well. In terms of surprises, Evan, not a lot, but there's a couple there for you that were surprises.
Yeah, so I think the first and the biggest one is just no action on productivity. We've sort of been skirting around that concept through the whole discussion, but again, there's no reform about making things more productive. Again, reform is taxation changes we've talked about and debated with GST, but it's also regulation decrease, freeing up of certain capitals into certain markets. It's about increasing also, productivity comes around, as Ben said, human beings are still our largest, capital that we have, and the productivity gap between hours worked and the amount of employment that we have is diverging to the largest it's basically been in history. There's no reform there. There's no ways of actually making, what we do more productive with better outcomes, with more efficiency. So they've been talking about productivity for the last 2 years. I genuinely watched the budget speech twice. So the half an hour that the Treasurer stood up on Tuesday, I've watched it twice through now. Not a single time did he mention the word productivity. Never. And he hasn't since. So this, again, is why what's caught me by surprise is after 2 years of holding the brakes, probably keeping, as Ben refers to them, the men in the black suits at bay, he's let go. And he's let go of the brake. The suits have come in through the door. And all of that reform that they were talking up, and it was talking up, has been left to some other time in the future. And productivity, as Ben pointed out perfectly, is the answer to this, is that you are here to expand the economy for the future and for the long-term prosperity of this country. There is no structure to suggest that that's coming anytime soon.
Just to that point, Evan, the success of Hawke Keating was that reform with Nick Kelty and the unions, right? I was trying to think of the actual full name of the union. I can't pull it out of my mind. But here's the deal. What we've got now is Tony Burke in there doing HR reform, which is definitely moving wages growth, which is, their big selling story in terms of wage growth story. But there's been no discussion in there about productivity. No. The secret sauce in what Keating and negotiated with the unions was you're going to have to lift your game. You're going to actually have to produce more to get more.
Yeah.
And ultimately, they were able to do that. Now, what we're saying
more
is,
for nothing.
Just give me more money, but you don't have to do as much work or do the same amount of work that you're doing, and that's why productivity is going backwards. So that is a major problem, and that's why Michelle Bullock is so big on that particular story in terms of when she's obviously noting it in her minutes and also in her press conference after each rate announcement. So that has to be something that if this Labor government stays in power, they're going to have to address, because ultimately we can't just keep giving wage rises with less productivity.
Evan, we got a question from a TPC listener, Jake Passmore. He says, have you been impressed by Labor's discipline in face of Greens' pressure and LNP's generally unsupportive politics? Before you answer that, I'd like to sort of pivot the discussion here back to housing, because clearly we're a property-centric podcast. But
which is where I was going to go. So
I'll give both of you an opportunity to talk to this in terms of housing. But to Jake's question, and the leader for the Greens, Adam Ban, came on breakfast TV as well on the day after the budget and said not enough, we needed more. Landlords can have, there was no pressure on landlords having as many rises as they like. Just that Ben and I have spoken at length on this podcast around how landlords can't be treated as ATMs for the states. But to Jake's question, and then housing in general, what was your commentary around this budget?
Yeah, so I was going to answer that. That's exactly what they have been quite good and still are with this budget, quite good around. They know, again, Ben's point's right. They are needing to get re-elected. The thing is, though, it's no longer, trying to find the purple, as I refer to it, in the middle between blue and red. It's also now they've got the brown. And by the brown, they've got the Greens on the left that are moving them that way as well. And they have to fend off, particularly in inner cities, the Green vote that is very much attuned to where, and it's not surprising, the highest density of student living is in inner city, the high level of universities are inner living, and therefore more likely than not they're renters. So the rent pressure question is something the Greens know very well, that appeals incredibly strongly to where their core voter group is, which tends to be those under 30 that are in education or are going through education that are renting. So they have managed to see off the idea of rental caps. They've managed to see off and have quite rightly managed to really point out why rental caps don't work, why they are very detrimental, issues that we've seen around the world when policies like that have been implemented. So to Jake's question, they've done well, and they are still, even with this budget, doing relatively well. However, they are having to appease to some of them. So again, the rental increases that we've seen last year, 15%, 10% this year, is also to that point that they know politically they have to somewhat keep that group, because it's traditionally, it's the kind of electorate area that they would have won. Now they're losing it, as I said, to the brown, where you are, merging red and green into this slight area where, hang on a minute, I do need rental assistance. I want a rental cap. Well, the Greens are telling me this. I'm going to go with them. And that's is the number one selling point you can tell the Greens are using to bring what would be a traditional Labor thought process to their side of the world.
And Ben, your views on the same topic, but also commentary around supply and the government's attempt to try and keep up with the amount of houses that they want to build over a 5-year period and look to be lagging behind.
Yeah, so let's go there first. The 1.2 million new dwellings is fictional. There's no way known, absolutely no way known they're going to get anywhere near it. And, whilst they understand that it's an issue, here's something that just completely blows my mind, right? In the papers, they talk about fast-tracking 1,900 new immigrant visas for people to work in housing construction. So you can let 600,000 people come into the country, and you can only find 1,900 people that have experience in building homes, that want to move to the greatest country on earth to help speed up the process. You need that to be 19,000, not 1,900. But, even 190,000 wouldn't be bad, because we've got construction booms happening, not just in residential, but also in infrastructure. So I'm just flabbergasted by, that naivety in terms of, that particular story. So that's a myth. It's a political stunt. It hasn't paid off for them. They will
double down on it, though, didn't they?
Yeah, they do. I mean, everyone knows that it's absolutely, not going to necessarily happen. It's totally impossible. I mean, usually we build around 150 to 160. I think we did peak in our building boom in 14-15, where we got over 200. We now not.
So I'm going to interrupt you. The peak, because I know this data directly. The peak we've ever done, 238,000 homes in 2018.
There you go.
To reach it,
predominantly
we have to make 242,000 homes from today going forward for the next 5 years to achieve it. So a record every single year from now going forward. And as Ben, you've put out in the RBA update, How are we going with construction approvals? 15% down every month. Is that about right? Like ridiculous.
And we know that obviously all the red tape that's involved in getting your permits and all of that through. I mean, where is that? Where is the, give it to us. We'll make all the improvements, and we'll say sorry to the people that we offend in the local government areas in terms of the inappropriate building that we're doing. I mean, the reality is this, that if the red tape and approvals don't come through, even if you've got the workers there, they can't start. Now, let's say you also then get all the approvals coming through, and then everyone's all the builders are quoting for jobs, and they're saying, "God, I've got so much work on. I'm just going to load that up by another 40%, because I don't really want the work, because I've got a pipeline of work for 2 years anyway. But if I load it up by 4, which is inflationary, right? I'll load it up, and if they still give me the work, I'll find some way of doing it, or I'll make excuses as to why it's delayed. But I just got a premium on it, which is totally inflationary." So I just find it, it's a challenging situation that we're in, because obviously immigration has played a role in increasing the demand for dwellings. But where's the other sort of initiatives? Like, okay, if you rent out a room, no longer will it impact your principal place of residence capital gains provision, right? For the next 5 years, you can start renting out rooms, and you can take a little bit of side hustle income, and we won't tax it. Right? So all of a sudden now we'll take the pressure off the rental market by doing something like that. And, it won't, because people are sitting back going, well, should I take an international student in? Should I take, a middle-aged female, recently separated into those particular homes, and, help her have board and build relationships and connections, and not be charged tax on that? I mean, there's just no critical thinking going on in terms of some of the innovative ways in which we can solve these problems. And so that's why we get to where we get to. And to the Greens point, I mean, God, yeah, if I'm a Greens Party member, this is a bonanza. Like, ultimately, perfect story for their new core, which is the millennials coming through, and also the next generation coming through, the alphas coming through, because they're basically saying, we will make rents cheaper for you. We are fighting for your cause. As opposed to necessarily the climate change, which was their original base. So this is going to give the Greens a bigger base, but unfortunately they're going to be telling half of the story, not the full story, which is all of these greedy property investors get $3 billion in additional tax rebates, but they forget to realise that a growing property market and growing values delivers about $30-odd billion of additional capital gains. I know the government would prefer to have the 30 billion instead of the 3 billion. So there's examples of where you've got to understand the decisions and the trade-offs that are associated with that.
Ben, as we work towards wrapping up, I'll come to you shortly, Evan. As your role as the chair of PICA,
yep.
It must have been a relief to not have the same experience that our good friend Bradley Beer had many budgets ago, where there was major reform to negative gearing. It's always in the spotlight, and the Greens are going to make that a pressure. But
yep.
What's your feedback from the perspective of PICA based on the budget on Tuesday night?
Yeah, so our policy position, Bryce, is that negative gearing is it's not even a thing inside tax policy. Basically, what it is that any cost in producing or running your small business are deductible, and that includes obviously interest charges. Now, you don't want to run a small business to run a loss forever, so eventually those businesses will turn profit. So you need a bit of incentive to be able to get those in, and to that point, we're seeing Victoria touting, the capital of build to rent. And that's because they're giving the big end of town, the super funds and these big construction and development companies, tax-free write-offs of land tax for the next 40 years. So only to make the product, have an economic return. Outside of that, it doesn't. So the small business owner that runs 2.3 million small business owners who effectively provide a critical number, 30+% of the rental stock in the market, are getting nothing from governments, and ultimately big business is going to get that. Now, I'm all for build to rent being part of the mix. So that's fine, but don't change negative gearing. In terms of capital gains exemptions, we understand it. Our policy is this. They keep talking about speculating in property and all of these types of things. Well, we agree that we don't want speculators coming in and basically just trading property. What we want is long-term small business owners running their investment properties and building financial security for them and their family. So how would you do that? Well, hypothetically, why don't you trial, and this is our policy, for the first 12 months, 0 exemption, then 10%, 20%, 30%, 40% each respective year. So year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. So when you get up to 5 years of owning that property, you're back up to that 50% capital gains exemption. And I think that is a reasonable model to take out those speculators in the market, but also make sure that we continually provide the critical amount of rental accommodation we need as part of a flexible and agile economy, as we need to move that human capital around for those job opportunities that are created across our cities and towns across Australia.
And the Victorian government also seeing what it looks like to disincentivise investors with the amount that are coming out. But we won't go there now. We'll do that on a future episode.
Yes.
Evan, as I come to you to wrap up with your final comments, anything that you want to say to round out, including my question to you, which is the first question I asked you is, what were you expecting and did you see it? I'm going to ask you the question, if you were in the same circumstances as the Treasurer with the same agenda, right? Because clearly your agenda as a market commentator is different to his. But if you're in the in his position, in his shoes with his agenda, would you have delivered the same budget or would you have done anything differently?
Oh, you've already asked. The question answers itself. I clearly wouldn't. I would, however, understand his positioning if he was to put in things like indexation with the 300 cap. Like, why does every household get the $300 when realistically it could have been scaled to those that need it more with the 300 and down further to 0 over a certain sort of threshold of income? Same with the
wasn't that a logistic problem? The service providers didn't have access to what we all
No, it doesn't bring inflation down as much, Bryce. So you do it blanket across the mechanism. Otherwise, if you only do it to, say, 1 million households, it's not going to get their inflation story down, right? Yep. So the political story around inflation, and the biggest problem with Labor and Liberal is interest rates are always higher under Labor was always the great claim because ultimately they kept spending all the money, which was always inflationary, and that's why the Liberals always argue that they're better economic managers. Whether that's
always the case.
No, it's definitely not always the case, right?
So that's what. So again, answering your question, that was the first one, right? I don't mind helping the lower socioeconomic groups if it's for the right reason. And Ben's highlighted why it's not been done for the right reason. It's been done for a disinflation scenario to happen inside energy rather than helping the electorate as a whole. I mean, you can hear in the last 48 hours, the Prime Minister and the Treasurer tie themselves in knots when they get these questions. Why are you giving billionaires this current subsidy? They don't need it. I'd even argue that anybody making $300,000 or more doesn't really need $300 in their back pocket. Oh, everybody needs one. The whole election. We know Middle Australia, $300,000 is not Middle Australia. So again, that's the first one that you can see that I'd probably say yes and no. Second one, Ben's also said this, and I say it as well. Market mechanisms are key. Free market movements are key. I do and have said very clearly the future made in Australia is a flawed policy that will end up in a massive mistake. So green energy, absolutely, I'm fully for that. I am absolutely.
If we win on green hydro, that is a game changer.
That's a game changer.
That is a game changer.
Absolutely. So I'm absolutely for that. But a government should not be picking winners, right? A government should not be subsidising businesses that then become completely beholden to government subsidies to survive. And that's what history has shown things like this does. So I'm all for making things if it's provided across the whole board, not just certain areas. So quantum, great example. Fantastic. Quantum computing is a very clever thing, but $1 billion to one provider, that's ridiculous.
And it's a moonshot.
Yeah.
Well, it's a moonshot in terms of whether we get there or not, right?
And so the probability of failure is really large. And that's, the probability of waste is really large. So in answer to you, these are the things that sort of catch me. And I will go back and look through Josh Frydenberg's last budget and do exactly the same thing. So please, if you listen to this is not me picking, like Ben said before, on this government. This is where the economics and the politics blurring that become a budget go crystal in one area and completely black in the other. And the black side is now come in the economics, and the political choice is happening. And, whether it's a red or blue persuasion, that's what's catching my attention here, is that all of that restraint, getting back to the viewer's question with Joel, they had done so well for 2 years, in my view, of restraining themselves, going down what they should be doing, which is what they believe in. That's why they were put in power, and that's what they were voted in for. But overall, they were pretty centralist to what they're doing. They've let go, and they've now gone to, we think these guys are good for this reason. We're going to pick them as a winner, not worry about the rest. We're going to do this. We're going to give everybody a deduction because it's an inflation fixer rather than an actual good economic policy. That's what catches my attention.
Thank you. Good discussion, gents. I think hopefully that's helped, now that we're in the shadow, a couple of days old in terms of the shadows of what was delivered on Tuesday night. Really good insights from the both of you. I am going to give myself the 3 votes for making sure that this podcast stayed under 2 hours. With the 2 of you.
I was going to ask you, Bryce, have you got a view? Have you got what was your read?
So my view is simply, I'm not in the weeds anywhere as detailed as the 2 of you, right? But for all of what you've said to this point, I still think it's, which is why I asked the question for Evan a couple of times throughout this piece is, what would you have done differently with the same agenda and the same objectives? And will it ever change going forward with all things happening? Because I don't think that, what's in the best interest to your point, Evan, electorate or population, I don't think that actually matters when we're playing a political game that will largely win on the day. So, so therefore, my view is as long as the thing that I advocate for the most is for people to have a swing and have a go and be able to self-fund their retirement. And from this budget, for all intensive purposes, still allows us to do that. I think largely it was a budget that was as expected, and I didn't expect anything else. So I'm happy with that. So. Hey, how did I go volunteering for politics, boys? I stayed on the fence pretty well there.
There's no party for you because they don't exist, fence sitters.
Yeah. Well, no, they donkey vote. That's all right.
There's a few that sort of moonlight in that. Hey, I've recruited you too for the Lifehack, Evan. So I want you to help with the table of truth. You talked about it at the beginning of the interview, and I want you to actually talk to this point for our audience. Audio only, so they can't look at a table, they can't see any visuals. We just got to explain why a number of economists don't watch the federal budget speech. They don't listen to any of the rhetoric or the commentary after. They go straight to the table of truth. You have touched on it earlier, but why is it important, and why is it the reason I want to bring it up as a life hack is because it enables people to actually digest every budget going forward if they actually get the concept to land. So if you could do that as a form of helping people not only this week but next year and the year after.
So the reason it's called the table of truth is that it takes away all the political elements we've just spoken about for the last hour and a half, because all it shows you is the increase or decrease in net government spending. So it's the table of truth, shows the net effect of government decisions and what it's done to the bottom line. So for this budget around, we have seen that the table of truth shows that they've expanded spending to over $24.8 billion over the next 4 years. No matter what you do, no matter how you hear it, that's all you need to know. They've increased spending by $24.8 billion, and that's what the table tells you. That's the difference between what it was and what it is now. They're putting an additional amount of money into the economy. Sometimes they take it away, and that's what you can also argue. That's why that table matters more than anything. All the political spin, who gets it, who wins, who loses. You just need to know how much more is going in or how much is coming out.
I think it's really important. We'll put a link into to an article from the Australian Financial Review. It is behind a paywall, so some won't be able to see it, but it actually shows a table since the early 2000s, and there's not much above the line in that table at all.
There is not. There is not much in that table that is within, spitting distance of the line. In
Spending addictions, mate.
Yeah.
And
it literally just keeps getting, it's almost a 45-degree angle from the neutral line to the spending, what are they? Not even towers. They're tunnels, negative, going underground. I don't know what sort of, imagery
and
you
as
want to play
there. Can I add to the life hack?
2% is gone, long gone.
Can I add to the life hack? It's as simple as this. We've talked about the macro stuff, all the stuff that potentially we're not necessarily in control of, right? As one vote, we may not be able to influence an outcome, but I still say vote. But here is the message, and it's been the message that we've had since this podcast started, and that is simple. If it is to be, it's up to me. You cannot trust your government to basically live your life and for you to prosper. You got to do it yourself. You got to take action on your own terms and control your own controllables, because that is ultimately who's going to be the person who looks after your financial security for yourself and ultimately for your family. So we can have these big macro discussions and talk about where the mistakes are being made. At the end of the day, the politicians are the men in the arena. We're the people in, in the bleachers having our comments and so forth. But if you want to be someone who's in the arena, who's actually making a difference, then you're in control of that. And ultimately, that will always be the case. So don't rely on governments to help you out. Just basically get about working hard, doing the best you can, making more smarter decisions than dumb decisions, and ultimately see how you go. And that should deliver you over the longer term financial security, financial peace of mind, and hopefully a lifestyle by design.
Well said, Ben. Thank you, Evan. Folks, that should definitely help you for this budget and every other budget. And to Ben's point, and to hopefully the point of the whole podcast for the last hour or so, that if you don't look after yourself, you can see that some of the decisions that are being made don't often have any base in logic. Quite often, that logic is thrown out the window when there's something else that's more addictive and more juicy, and that's power. And that's what our political parties are chasing. So very, very good. So Ben, what's making property news?
Well, Bryce, we know that the Western Australian market is one of the hottest markets in the country, right? There's a lot of good reasons why it's hot. It's obviously running a surplus over there. The economy is moving well. They've got strong population growth. All of the triggers are showing that it's obviously a very, very good market to invest in, right? Now, when you've got that, what you also then want to do is, say, well, who do I potentially get to use to help me potentially buy over there? Because a lot of East Coast people are looking at potentially diversifying. We talk about being borderless investors. So I'm sort of putting my hat on as the pick a chair here, Bryce, and I'm hearing rumors, right? And that's all they are. I have no direct evidence yet, but I'm hearing rumors of how certain buyers agents are conducting themselves in that particular market. First things first, what we need to understand is real estate or land legislation. So in terms of, the whole titles legislation is state-based. Now, what you potentially should be having is, if a buyer's agent is looking to buy property in Western Australia for you, the first question you should ask them is, are they licensed to buy real estate in Western Australia? Because again, we've got, sort of rumors and all of that sort of stuff happening that there are East Coast buyers agents who are buying in Western Australia, in some cases sight unseen, and they aren't even licensed to operate over there. Now, if a real estate agent is taking a fee as a buyer's agent, they need to be licensed or they need to be an authorised rep. So that's the first question. The second question and rumour we're also hearing around there is there are stories around potential kickbacks or hidden commissions being paid from the buyer's agent. So the real estate agent acting on behalf of the buyer is giving potentially the real estate agent who's acting on behalf of the seller a little soft dollar or backdoor commission to be able to get first rights to potentially negotiate on the property or to potentially buy that property. Now, all I'm saying, it's rumours and innuendo at this stage, but if you do know of any of this that's happening, please report it into me, because we will give it to the authorities, because it really is important, because this is an illegal practice, right? You cannot, under the law, as operating as a licensed real estate agent, take a fee on both sides of the transaction. There is a massive conflict of interest that is going on there. Now, you might be saying, well, how does it impact me? And that's a fair question, in terms of, if my buyer's agents paying out of their fee that I pay them some kickback money to the property manager or the selling or listing agent, how is that going to impact me? Well, technically, is there a risk that transaction could actually be technically void in the event that there was a breach of the licensing regulations? Now, I'm no lawyer. I can't tell you whether that is true or not, but it would be tested in the courts to see whether that's possible. So, 2 questions you need to ask your buyer's agent if you're looking to use them to buy property in Western Australia. Number 1, are you a licensed real estate agent in Western Australia? Can you operate, i.e. and buy properties on my behalf over there? And then number 2, are you paying any commissions or kickbacks or any monetary or financial return to anyone that you're buying the property from, which is ultimately coming out of my pockets. Got that out. They are the two questions, because that is illegal, and they would absolutely be significantly problematic for those people if they're operating that way. So really what's making property news is more of a community announcement in terms of making sure that everyone's operating ethically and honestly through the correct laws to operate in buying property in Western Australia.
And the hack there is don't buy sight unseen. There's so many ways that you can be interstate, even if your buyer's agent is interstate, that you can actually still be buying with network and infrastructure on the ground, so you don't have to buy sight unseen by yourself or a proxy that's actually representing you, that's got your interest with no conflict of interest at heart. That's actually quite straightforward to do. So don't buy sight unseen. And I guess secondly, I think it just goes to highlight, Ben, why we've said all along that real estate is an insider's game, because there are games that are being played that some people would not even expect to be happening. So, for example, an open for inspection list that happens that a real estate agent quite often gives that to a buyer's agent, asks the buyer's agent to work the list, and if they get them, because it's clearly someone who's looking for that type of property, if the buyer's agent can get them to buy, quite often they share a very healthy component of the commission for doing that. So there is a bunch of stuff that happens in the real estate industry on both sides of the transaction, whether it's
allegedly,
real estate agent, whether it's project market. Yeah, allegedly, that's right. But I mean, I'm just talking experientially here that I've seen and I know. And we're not naming names.
No.
But the point is to make people aware that stuff goes on. But the reinforcing point here is that is why it's an insider's game, Ben. It's not an outsider's game, because there are sleights of hand, there's magician tricks, there is cloak and dagger, there's smoke and mirrors. There is stuff that is happening in real estate transactions each and every weekend that you as an outsider might not necessarily get to see or even know existed. So I guess that's your point as well in making that. But mate, we've covered a lot of ground today. Hopefully we've digested the budget in a way that gives everyone a fully understanding of the context and what's going on and why it was delivered and what some of the key components and how does that impact housing. And of course, we got the benefit of having some very sharp minds in this discussion with yourself and Evan as well. So, mate, until next week.
Well, and also thanks for Evan for joining us for this particular episode. Obviously, he's had to go off and do some other media commitments as well. So that's why we'll thank him here, but we couldn't thank him online. So until next week, Bryce, knowledge is empowering, but only if you act on it.
Well said. See you, folks.